Hi, Paul.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
No, I'm just great, except I'm losing my voice, but we should make it through the interview.
Oh, okay. I hope so. Well, for people watching or listening, my name is Carl Zimmer, and I'm a science writer, and I'm a pretty frequent speaker on Blogging Heads. And Paul, can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, I think so. I'm Paul Ehrlich. I'm a professor of biology at Stanford and a notorious doomsayer, so I can say doom right now.
Okay. Well, Paul, I guess your doomsaying is most associated with a book you wrote about 40 years ago now called The Population Bomb. What I wanted to talk mostly about today was your latest book, which I'm going to hold up to my camera here. It's called...
Can I hold it up to my camera, too?
Yeah, let's do that. Stereo book
there
covers.
There we go. It's a bright book cover. That's the last I'll do with a product hold, even though my face is ugly and I prefer the book to show.
Well, the book is called The Dominant Animal, Human Evolution and the Environment. And it's by Paul and his wife, Anne Ehrlich. I think for people who might only associate you with Population Bomb, they might be rather surprised to start reading the book and discover that it's not just about the problems that we face in the environment today, but it's a whole synthesis of sort of the human condition, including sort of the evolution of humans and biology and culture. It's quite a book of a quite huge scope. I mean, I'm just curious why you decided to take such a huge view of all of these issues in one book.
Well, for a very simple reason. I've been writing, of course, on these topics, hundreds of articles and many books for a long time, and what's dawned on me more and more, particularly with this long-running presidential campaign, is that the really crucial issues facing our society are not being discussed anywhere, particularly in the presidential debates. In other words, it's really important to know where we came from, and it's also important to know where we're going. And the two are connected, because where we came from tells us a lot about what we can do about where we're going. And a couple of years ago, I started teaching a course at Stanford called Human Evolution and the Environment, open to all students with no prerequisites, because you can get all the way through Stanford University without even knowing where your food comes from. We had a professor who thought that milk was manufactured, and I decided that we just couldn't do that anymore, and at least offer a course where students could learn something about how the world works. So that was the genesis of it, and people in the publishing company and so on thought that this would be a good idea to have something out where anybody in our country or in the world could find out how the world works and where we're going. So that's the genesis of the book.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So in your book, when you're looking at the rise of humans, it seems that culture or the capacity for cultural evolution instead of biological evolution is, for you, really key to human nature. What could you talk a bit about sort of what culture is and why it's so important to understanding the human condition?
Well, sure. I was originally trained as a geneticist, and was very impressed by how our genes put us together and make us a very, very bright animal. But in recent years, it's become clearer and clearer that most of the behavior that we're all interested in is not programmed into our genes. There just aren't enough genes to do it, but instead is programmed into us by our environments, including our prenatal environment. Culture is just the non-genetic information that we pass around, and particularly from generation to generation. And it's culture that is leading to our problem. That's why it's our development of culture, which goes way back to a lot of other things that are described in the book, that has made us the dominant animal on the planet. After all, we have altered the atmosphere. We mobilize mineral resources generally at much higher rates than they're mobilized naturally. We are controlling the whole planet, and in the process, we're busily wrecking our life support systems. And so the fact that we were able to evolve culture and that the culture itself evolves continuously, and that's something that we're working on a lot here at Stanford, all tie together into what the human predicament now is, which I think anybody who reads the newspapers can see is getting more severe every day.
So what gives us human culture? Is it just language? Is it the ability to manipulate?
Well, I can give you a quick. Let me give you a quick rundown of some of the key points. First of all, some of our ancestors were like tarsiers, scrambled around in bushes and caught insects, and that gave us, first of all, vision as our main sense. That is, if you're living in bushes or trees and you're jumping from branch to branch, if you smell the next branch, you tend not to survive. You've got to see it. And the grasping fingers have been very important. So our sight animals and being able to manipulate small things were very important when we were living in the trees. But it was also important that we came out of the trees because you can't practice agriculture in the trees, and you can't have a very big society if you don't practice agriculture. And then, of course, our brains expanded for reasons that are somewhat controversial, and we developed language. And language with syntax is the one thing that really distinguishes us from all other animals. It allows us to communicate in ways they can't. It allows us to accumulate memories, and when we got printing, we could write down those memories and pass them from generation to generation over many generations. And that kind of non-genetic information is our culture. If it hadn't been for our development of language and our development of printing and so on, we never would have been able to achieve the level of dominance on the planet that we have. We went from, say, roughly 5 or 10 million people around the time of the agricultural revolution to having almost 7 billion people now, each one putting huge pressure on the life support systems of the planet. Did I dodge your question?
No. That was exactly what I was wanting to talk about. It's interesting that how you're getting really interested in trying to work out kind of a theory of culture, and you talk a lot about that in the book. A way to understand how human culture works and how it changes, how it evolves. Something that could be on par with a theory of biological evolution. I guess. Yeah.
No, I was going to say, it should be clear to everybody why we need that. In other words, we are facing a dramatic possibility of climate change that could absolutely lead to utter disaster for our civilization. We are faced with gigantic new epidemics that could bring down our civilization. The planet is littered with the remains of civilizations that didn't make it because they didn't pay attention to their environmental situation. We are now in the unique position of, for the first time, having a worldwide civilization threatened with collapse. And our politicians and most people are not concerned about it or doing anything about it. So how do you change our culture? How do you move from having somebody like George W. Bush as president of the most powerful nation of the world to having somebody who's got a combination of smarts and ethics in that position and tries to do something about the big situation? It's really a desperate problem.
But if we're talking about huge cultural phenomena, how do just a few people even have much of an effect on culture then?
Well, first of all, we shouldn't have scientists dictating culture. What I'm actually involved in trying to develop now, there was, as you may know, several thousand scientists got together a few years ago and did a Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. What they were basically doing was evaluating the state of our life support systems. And their report is very simple. If you want to see a summary of it, go into your bathroom, look down into the toilet, and flush. And that's the direction our life support systems are going. And we're now trying to organize a Millennium Assessment of Human Behavior, which would get everybody together to discuss these issues. After all, scientists can't just provide answers. The answers have to come in part from below. And we'd like to organize meetings all over the world, which don't just include scientists, but include people from the religious community, ethicists, business, and so on, to discuss the critical issues that the scientific community has been discussing now for decades, but which just haven't gotten out into the public discourse. And so we're hoping to have a millennium assessment of human behavior. I'm going to Scandinavia in September to work with some people who are interested in generating those.
So having a better theory of culture can help you to work on these sorts of assessments.
Sure, to work on assessments and also try and find ways to modify cultural evolution in directions we want to go. For instance, we make good use of our knowledge of biological evolution, or we can make good use in doing things like controlling pests and fighting disease organisms and so on. There's no reason if we understand cultural evolution better, we can't find ways to change our behavior more rapidly. Can I give you a quick example?
Sure, absolutely.
We know that cultures can change very rapidly when the time is right. Good examples are how fast after the Second World War racial relations changed in the United States. The job opportunities for women changed. In about 1970, our reproductive behavior changed very rapidly. We moved quickly to smaller families. And maybe the most familiar example is, although nobody expected it, communism retreated, the Soviet Union dissolved, the Berlin Wall came down, and the whole world changed. We don't, at the moment, know how those things happen, why they happen. But if you want to change, it tells us that, for instance, if we want to change the way we treat the environment and each other, it can happen very rapidly if we understand how to trigger it. But what we don't do now is understand how to trigger it.
Yeah, but I guess I'm still a little unsure about this, because, I mean, you could conceivably come up with a theory of culture and say, aha, we understand how these cultural changes work, and our theory shows us that there's no way that we can control it. I mean, we can understand, for example, how galaxies form, but that doesn't mean that we're going to be able to go out and make a galaxy for ourselves.
You're exactly right. I mean, there is uncertainty in this, but
Your
uncertainty is well-founded. In other words, I'm certainly not saying I have all the answers, or science has all the answers, or if we understand cultural evolution, we can get the change. That's one of the reasons, for instance, that I think we've got to involve many, many more people so everybody will understand what's at stake, and it gives us a better chance of finding solutions. But I'm sure not saying I've got all the solutions. What I know is summarized between the covers of The Dominant Animal. I think we have in the past, as human beings, overcome incredible barriers and done marvelous things, and we're smarter than hell. The issue is, can we get around this one, or are we going to let civilization go down the drain because we're not paying attention?
It's ironic that as you talk about in your book, that the solution, in a sense, to our problem is the very thing that you argue got us into this problem in the first place. In other words, human culture and intelligence and so on, the ability to extract resources and so on and so forth. I mean, the one way to deal with it is to use this capacity, but in a different way.
That's right. I mean, we've had the capacity to take over the planet. We haven't paid enough attention to the consequences of that. There are a number of reasons for this. For one thing, I think in our genetic evolution, we've evolved as relatively short-term animals. If the climate was changing on Homo erectus, a million years ago, there was nothing they could do about it. I mean, that was it. They weren't causing the change, and so on. We've never really evolved to look at even the medium term, let alone the long term, until very recently. And it takes a lot of cultural evolution to look at the long term. The short term things we do automatically. If a car swerves towards you, you don't have to think about what to do about it. It's already programmed. You know how to leap out of the way, and so on. But if the climate is changing, it's going too slowly. In fact, a psychologist and I both think, we've written about this in the past, that contrary to that, we've evolved to keep our environmental background constant as we can, because we want to be able to see those rapid threats, like the tiger jumping at us, or what have you.
When you say to keep the background constant, you mean that we're actually sort of blocking a lot of information about the environment so that we can just focus on immediate things, is what you're saying.
Right. I mean, you don't want to have, you can't have, stimuli coming in all the time that the climate is changing, There's a very common example one can give of how we tune out things that we don't have to react to or don't think we have to react to. When you sat down in your chair to do this program, you went through a very complex set of neuromuscular changes, and when your butt hit the seat, it signaled to you that you're down, and you forgot about it. Mm-hmm. And it is until I tell you now, or to any listener now, that you're still getting messages from your butt that you're sitting down. And now you can feel them, but you were not aware of them at all because you habituated, you tuned them out. Mm-hmm. It's just like when the air conditioner comes on, you hear it come on, but after a minute, you don't hear it anymore, right? And in a sense, we're designed to keep the environment constant, the standard parts of the environment, only react to relatively sudden changes. But climate change isn't sudden. The accumulation of nuclear weapons isn't sudden. The generation of new flu viruses in Asia is not really sudden. And these are things that we don't deal with very well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. One thing I found interesting in your book was in talking about cultural evolution. You talked a bit about what probably most people who are familiar at all with cultural evolution these days might know about, which is things that are called memes, which Richard Dawkins first introduced, I guess, about 30 years ago now. And you don't see memes as a very good, very promising way to understand how culture evolves. Maybe you could explain why and what might be a better way of looking at it.
Well, I think it was a good idea to begin with. You got to understand that good ideas in science are ones that lead people to look at various issues and try and find better ways of doing things, and I think Dawkins should get a lot of credit for coming up with the idea of memes. It was sort of a parallel to a gene. We pass our genes from generation to generation. Certain kinds of ideas may sort of colonize your mind and be put on, and so on and so forth. The problem is that in 30 years, it really hasn't led anywhere, and there are a lot of reasons for that. Maybe the easiest way to see it is the famous children's game, I think it's called Telephone, where you get 15 kids in a circle, and you whisper to the first one, the card is the ace of spades, and when you get around it, and it's whispered around the circle, and the last person says the message is, Jane Fonda is a great movie actress. And the problem with memes is, unlike genes, for instance, are largely transmitted without modification. You cannot not refuse to accept them. You can't change them purposely, and so on. So it's a really very different dynamic from ideas which can be changed not just by accident, but on purpose, and can be modified in all kinds of ways. So it hasn't led to the kind of theory that I would have liked to have seen, or that most of my colleagues would have liked to have seen. But it's been an important idea because it's allowed people to, to discuss the issues and say, okay, it's not going this way, then how is it going to go? In other words, you should not, it's in no way a criticism of Dawkins. It was a good idea. It just didn't pan out the way a lot of us hoped it would.
So what's the state of the art now in terms of cultural evolution, do you think?
Well, there's some very good modeling of relatively limited systems going on. For instance, joint cultural transmission of things like tolerance to lactose problems. There's a lot of modeling. A lot of stuff is going on in the study of cultural evolution now. Mathematical models of relatively simple systems, looking, for instance, at how the ideas of the people that surround you affect what your conclusions will be. A colleague and I just finished a paper that is kind of interesting. It's got a nice reception, showing that parts of culture that are tested against the environment evolve, in this case, more slowly than parts that aren't. The basis of that was the obvious observation that our technology is changing extraordinarily rapidly. And it's obviously, again, tested against the environment. It either works or it doesn't. But our ethics are evolving much more slowly. I mean, we still have the same ethical problems that bothered Plato, but the technology we have today would stun Plato completely. And we were able to show that in Polynesian canoes, and it sounds like a weird system, but it's one of the few we could get to, that in Polynesian canoes, the structural features that determined in part whether you survived the voyage evolved much more conservatively than the things that were decorative. that showed who you were and made the canoe look prettier and so on. And so people are working at the edges of it, but we still haven't come to a real equivalent of a Darwin in cultural evolution. And that's what I think we need, or at least we need a lot more attention to the issue. Most people don't realize that their non-genetic information, their culture is changing all the time, and that their futures and society's future depend on the directions of that cultural evolution. We're not having the discussions about that.
The thing that I wonder about is that what Charles Darwin was able to do was to take all the wonderful diversity and complexity in nature and distill just a few principles about variation and selection to come up with a mechanism to explain the patterns that we see today. And I just wonder if that could even be done with human culture, because it's so complex, and it's not. It doesn't seem like it can be reduced to real simple little components.
I'd like to believe it can be. I mean, nature is extraordinarily complex. Remember, you're talking about he was looking at the interactions of billions of populations and millions of species, and he came up with a general pattern. And I've been working, for instance, to get the historians, so is Jared Diamond, by the way, to get the historians more interested in getting sort of big picture theory for how things actually change. And I think there's real potential there. And I indicated some of it in the book. But until we get all the social scientists together and some humanitarians and so on to say, look, let's get ourselves a theory of cultural evolution. Let's look at the big picture. Let's not look at everything as if it was a unique scrap that can't be put into a bigger picture. I don't think we'll succeed. The ball is really in the court of the social scientists. The physical and natural sciences have shown us how the world works to a very large degree. We're trying to get historians involved in this because we can't simply try and get little pieces of everything and assume that it's a unique situation. We've got to go back, for instance, in history to the tradition that goes back to people like Toynbee of trying to look at the overall patterns, explain why societies work the way they do, generate the kind of histories they do. We've had substantial luck with economists over the last 2 decades, working very closely with them and looking at very difficult issues like can you have, we have a big problem with overconsumption. And we know what to do about overpopulation. We've got condoms and morning after pills, but we don't have any consumption condoms or consumption morning after pills, although one of my colleagues suggested that we could invent a mechanism by which you could have a shopping spree one day, and then there'd be an outfit run by the government that would come back the next day and reclaim all the merchandise and take it back to the stores. But so there's a lot of potential out there, and we're working very hard to organize it. I think the ball is really in the court of the social scientists today. They've got to get reorganized and particularly get rid of their preposterous disciplinary boundaries. How can you possibly be a political scientist without knowing economics and sociology and vice versa? So there's a lot of work to do, but it's interesting work intellectually.
Another thing that I found interesting in your book was the perspective you gave of humans as a species in a particular ecological niche and the ecological effect of our species on the world at large. I mean, that's sort of where the title of the book comes from, the dominant animal. When you say that we are dominant, and you're talking in sort of an ecological sense, what do you mean?
Well, we're dominant in the sense that we have enormous power to change the lives of virtually every other organism on the planet. For instance, we are changing the climate. Virtually every other organism has to respond to the climate. We're dominant in the sense that we have wiped out many, many populations around the planet. So we harvest what we want. For instance, we've utterly changed the oceans. They're nothing like they were when human beings first appeared because we've harvested the vast majority of the edible fishes already. I mean, today we have maybe 5% of the larger fishes that existed, and that would be an optimistic assumption compared to those that were around, say, in just 1400. So we are altering the entire planet, and we do have, of course, the capacity to destroy it. All you have to do is think of the nuclear winter studies who were involved in 20 years ago. We have enough nuclear weapons still to basically destroy society and permanently alter the planet in many dimensions. So we're the powerhouse. We've gotten to be the powerhouse by being extremely smart and having a very, very complex culture. Some other organisms have culture in the sense of transmitted non-genetic information. Chimps do, some birds do, and so on. But none of them have anything remotely on the scale of the culture we have. Mm-hmm. We particularly on the technological area, we have millions and millions of times more information developed than we have in our genes. So culture is really the dominant thing, and we've either got to learn how to use our wonderful culture to our advantage or let it wreck us. And it's a choice everybody ought to be involved in.
When you look today at the headlines, for example, the high cost of oil, the high cost of food, how do you see those sorts of stories fitting in with your book? I mean, it unfortunately seems like your book is, which is coming out now at the end of June, is quite timely.
Well, I think it's all part of the same general picture. There are too many people for the planet to support in the long term. We are trying per person to consume too much. We have incredible problems of equity. That is, some people are overfed and many, many people are malnourished and underfed, and of course that makes them great targets for generating new epidemics. Now, of course, there's all kinds of political things in there. The food prices are going up rapidly, not just because there are too many people, but because of a lot of our cultural behavioral patterns. And because, for instance, we have chosen to try and feed our SUVs by using corn and soybeans and sugarcane, not in ways that would enhance the food for people, but to feed SUVs. So there are a lot of political decisions in there. Half of the infrastructure of the United States is deteriorating very rapidly. Where might we find the money to fix it up? Well, about half of our military budget is designed to keep the flow of oil going, as you may have seen in the papers in the last couple of days. The fact that everybody who was knowledgeable about the Middle East knew the Iraq invasion was about oil has finally been admitted by the government and the big oil companies. So, there are lots of political decisions that are making a fundamentally bad situation worse. The climate change is happening more rapidly than any scientist that I know personally, and I know some of the best people in the field, many of them, expected. And the situation is deteriorating very rapidly, and what is the public worried about? Can gays get married? Which movie starlet is wearing her panties today? In other words, we're getting nonsense from the media and no real deep discussion by the politicians, and it's very depressing for the scientists. Mm-hmm. And all of my colleagues are very depressed, I can assure you.
I'm also curious about how you look at the current state of the planet, given your long experience in trying to understand these issues and then to try to think about scenarios about how things are going to go. So, I mean, for example, with population bomb, you were talking about the dangers of overpopulation, the possibility of famine, and so on. After you came out with that book, and then 40 years have passed, there have been lots of changes in the population that, at least for some people, I don't know how it has been for you, have been somewhat surprising. A slowing of the population growth, even, not just in Europe but in other countries around the world. Does that?
Well, that shows you that some concerted action by society as a whole can be very helpful. In other words, one of the really cheery things has been that in the last 40 years, social scientists in particular have learned what needs to be done to limit population sizes and preferences for children, and that's happened over a lot of the world. I mean, the main thing, of course, has been educating women, giving them job opportunities and so on, and there's been a not rapid enough but very cheering drop of birth rates where it's most necessary because, of course, the major countries that are even moving towards population decline are the ones that have the high consumption per person, which is what basically causes the environmental problems. So on the population front, I've been very cheered. Unhappily, the population bomb turns out to have been too optimistic a book because, remember, 40 years ago, we didn't know anything about the destruction of the ozone layer. We didn't know that there was another full greenhouse forcing in the non-CO2 area so that the global heating would be a problem for this century, for early in this century rather than late. And Norman Myers hadn't pointed out to us that we were losing the tropical forests and the biodiversity in them. It's absolutely crucial to our future. We did predict that there was going to be big epidemics, but AIDS had not yet appeared as an example of that. So in many respects, the population bomb was too optimistic. It was too pessimistic about how rapidly green revolution technologies would be adopted, so that we've only lost to hunger about 10 million people a year since the book was written, and I would have expected it from what the agriculturists were saying to be much greater, but we're now facing the problems created by the green revolution, which fed a lot of people, but which made us extremely vulnerable to climate change by making our crops very uniform. For instance, over South Asia, both wheat and rice, two of our three most important foods, are growing very close to their climate limits. And we're not putting the research money into the consultative group in agricultural research to see if we can get strains that will remain productive at higher temperatures. That's one of the things we ought to be doing, but we're not doing it. It's not clear we can do it. So it's a very complex situation. I've been cheered by what's happened a lot on the population front, but a lot more could have been done. I've been horrified about what's happened in many other areas. Am I depressing you totally?
Well, but on the other hand, well, a bit, I have to say. But but on the other hand, you what you're talking about there points out that that things don't necessarily have to end badly, and that even something as an issue as colossal as the world human population can change in complicated ways and unexpected ways, and sometimes for the better.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, listen, I wouldn't be having this interview with you if I thought the situation was hopeless. I tend to be very optimistic about what could be done. I tend to be, listening to the politicians these days, very pessimistic about what will be done. They're very different things. That's why I've shifted my focus so much to cultural evolution, because I'd like to see our society change to take these issues seriously. There's a lot of talk about climate change, but more carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases are going into the atmosphere every decade, and we should have started reducing them 50 years ago. And, you know, this is not, the science is not all that new on climate change. The basic numbers were worked out in the 1890s.
Something that I was going to ask about before, but this is a good place to ask about it, is in terms of cultural evolution. I mean, another unexpected aspect of cultural evolution is the way that that we are exchanging these ideas. And so, for example, you and I are talking, having a conversation that's going to be on the internet, which anybody in the world theoretically could watch. And that, in a sense, would seem to me to be speeding up transmission of these ideas and sort of awareness of some of these problems. Have you thought much about how the changes in communication could play into dealing with the problems that you've been talking about?
No, I haven't. I think it's basically a good thing. There are also, however, downsides to it, and I don't like the trend towards people making a life on the internet. You know, that they living in virtual reality instead of in real reality, although real reality is being phased out now. But I think the ability to have rapid communication is an excellent one, but you got to ask what's being communicated. Our group actually did a study and asked, are we really in an information age? And one of the questions is, how do you count the disinformation? In other words, I looked up missing link, which is an evolutionary term on Google a while back, and the first 25 sites I found were creationist sites.
Yeah,
so you have
the creationists are very good on the internet.
Yeah, so I mean, the problem is we have this problem with our students all the time. We want them to use the web, but we have to somehow insert the filters so they can tell the nonsense from the real stuff. In other words, are the millions of porn sites part of our information age? And so it's again, like everything else, I can't give you a simple answer that, yeah, the internet's a good thing. It's just like globalization. Some parts of globalization I think are excellent, and some parts are absolutely horrifying. And you can't just say globalization is good or globalization is bad, or immigration is good or immigration is bad. It's all got to be qualified, and I guess scientists have too much of a tendency not to commit themselves on these things because we see the complexities all the time.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So how would you envision us as a species reducing our consumption and our impact on the world resources?
Well, I would start, if we get this Millennium Assessment of Human Behavior going, I would start by asking the question, what the hell are people for and what do we want? When I was young, when Ann and I were married, even though my salary was pathetic, that's continued to be pathetic at Stanford, but pathetic, the two of us could live on it with our daughter. Now all the young couples I know have to work. Both of them have to work. Everybody's scrounging to get more and more stuff. And is more and more stuff really what we want as human beings? Whatever happened to leisure? Whatever happened to having lots of time for sex? I mean, I think automobiles are great devices for teenagers to make love in, but they're terrible devices for getting to work in. And we really ought to think about what we want. And I think if you think about that, that a lot of people could be weaned away from the, he who has the most stuff when he dies wins. Philosophy. And I've been talking with my economist colleagues about what is necessary to have a viable economy without this perpetual growth in consumption. And that's one of the trickiest issues, both politically and also scientifically. How do you deal with it? And that's one of the things we're working on. But again, you need lots of people's input on it. There are very few advantages to getting to be older. But, I remember in the 1940s, even during the Second World War, we had a very pleasant life in many ways because we were fortunate in the United States to not be, if somebody in your family wasn't killed, to not be directly really heavily impacted by the Second World War. We had refrigerators that cooled our beer, and, we could take hikes in the woods, and lots of books to read, and so on and so forth. And even, I think, again, it's personal choice, obviously, but people ought to think really hard about whether they're getting out of life what they want. And we can't really design a world which has lots of options for everybody until we decide what most people want in what ways and what the differences are and how you handle it. And that's, again, what a Millennium Assessment of Human Behavior would try and do.
But would anybody pay attention to that? I mean,
I doubt it.
Well, the thing is that as a science writer, I mean, I get lots of press releases about lots of reports from scientists where they take all the information that they've been trying to assemble, and present it to the world. With the exception of the IPCC reports on global warming, there aren't that many that seem to really make people stop and say, "Oh, hey, we need to be doing something differently."
That's what we want to do with. Oh, sorry.
I was just going to say, in my experience, scientists really like to come out with reports, and they think that that's going to really change everything. And I guess I'm a little skeptical about that. Am I wrong?
I'm very skeptical of it myself. That's why our plan for the Millennium Assessment of Human Behavior would involve people from all over the place, not scientists coming out with reports. And I'm not, the essence of it's already there. There's a famous old story of a scientist going to a woman, say in 1920, and saying, isn't science wonderful? Now you can talk to your son. She's in New York. You can talk to your son in California on the telephone like he was really here. And she said, look, if science hadn't invented the automobile, he'd really be here. And I think people do care about how they live and what the environment's like and what their friends have to face and so on. But they feel helpless to do anything about it on a large scale. And that's where I would hope that we could start of having a discussion of humanity where, my own, this is pure personal prejudice and unscientific, but I think when you look at, for instance, the battles between the Arabs and the Jews, or the ones that went on in the Balkans, or so on and so forth, most people just want to have a decent life, live with their friends, raise their children, have their children get educated, have enough food to eat, and so on. It's the very small percentage of people who really feel they have to do battle over ancient rights and things like that. And I think that the more we can talk to each other, I would hope the more we talk to each other, the more we can find common humanity. We're a small group animal, and we're trying to live in gigantic groups. And one of the things we have to do is face that and find ways to retain the pleasures of the small group, your friends, your relatives, your county, your nation, whatever, while not feeling necessary to battle the other small groups. In other words, we should value our diversity and not fight it. And, the problem is this is very pie-in-the-sky stuff. But what's the alternative? Going down the drain. In other words, everybody says, well, people will never do X, Y, or Z. Well, people have done a lot of X, Y, and Z over time. And we got to quickly pick the right X, Y, and Z to do now, or we're not going to, you and I won't be able to have this kind of conversation.
And what about in terms of our use of energy? I mean, it's been interesting. For me to watch some environmentalists make some pretty dramatic shifts. For example, even going so far as to put nuclear energy back on the table as a plausible alternative to just lots of coal-fired plants. What's your sense about where we have to go in terms of energy consumption?
Well, first of all, I think there's people who know energy say the first energy source that we've got to tap is efficiency. We don't do anywhere near what we ought to be doing. In other words, one of the really ridiculous things in the presidential campaign was ideas like taking off our tiny little gasoline tax in order to reduce people's costs of using a lot of oil. There's been a lot of work by economists. Every economist I know personally thinks that oil prices and gasoline prices should be much higher, but they should be made higher by taxes that are then recycled into the FICA system, which is a regressive tax. You don't hurt poor people. But everybody thinks that that gasoline is much too cheap. Remember, it's cheaper than bottled water. But that's not what the politicians understand. So the first thing you got to have is much more efficiency. Then what the sources are, unfortunately, this idiotic government has been cutting its R&D funds going into energy areas because, of course, they are owned by the oil companies and they want to keep burning oil even if it destroys the world. They're mostly elderly and what do they care? But it's clear that we need a mix of energy technologies, that we need much more research to determine the proper mix. A lot of it undoubtedly would have to be solar in one form or another now. That includes wind. Nuclear, as always in my view and that of my colleagues, remained as a possibility for part of the mix if it's done with the appropriate cautions, which are substantial but not impossible. It can be done. But the key thing to remember is you also have to have portable fuels. And, for instance, nuclear and coal-fired plants just produce electricity. So what do you have to decide whether you're going to switch to a hydrogen economy in which you use that electricity to decompose water and make hydrogen, and then you have the terrible problems of where you start, because if you're the first person to buy a hydrogen car in your area, where do you get refilled? This was where we need huge amounts of research and development to start moving in the right directions, even though we're many decades late. And the energy problem is a good example of where the government has been screwing around. The CAFE standard should have been raised infinitely compared to what they have been. We should not, we should get the SUVs off the street unless they're used for genuine, need things. But we're not ready for that yet, and unfortunately, I think that means we're facing discontinuities. That is, gasoline prices sooner or later will get to the point where you can't drive an SUV, and that is going to start a more rapid trend towards more efficient cars. But we also ought to be redesigning our cities. We designed our cities around the automobile over the last roughly 100 years, and the next 100 years should be redesigning them around people.
In what way?
What? I'm sorry.
In what way?
I sorry, I couldn't hear it. Something broke up.
In what way could cities be redesigned?
Well, if you design cities around people, you start designing them so people either work from home or live close to where they work and walk or bike when they can. You put in safe mass transit systems. You reserve the cars for teenagers to make love in, and you have cars that probably are jointly owned by several families so that they can be used for vacations and that sort of thing. But we design the city so you can get around without having an automobile, and most cities in the United States you basically can't anymore. And there's no reason. They once were designed so you could get around without an automobile. They can be designed that way again. And that's another place where thoughtful urban designers and architects and so on can get together and start designing a world in which you walk to work. I mean, one of the reasons I've been at Stanford now for 49 years, one of the reasons I've stayed is I can walk to work. Because before I came to Stanford, I had to commute, and it destroyed every day. I mean, I come home exhausted, just pile into bed and get up in the morning to do it was in Chicago, to do the commute again. So I don't see any of road rage just because one person didn't turn a corner fast enough in his car to suit the person following. I mean, what's the point of driving a couple of hours every day being shot out on the freeway when you could, if you had safe mass transit, you could at least have you having a drink on your way home.
In the book, you have a section where you say basically the header is basically why should we preserve biodiversity, and that's a subject that's been kind of obscured in recent years by the attention to global warming and its impacts. I mean, biodiversity used to be much higher in people's minds. Today, what do you see as the situation in which biodiversity is, and why do you think we should preserve it, and what's the best way to do that?
Well, of course, they're both tied together. For instance, if we destroy the Amazon basin and its biodiversity, we're likely to change the climate in ways that will be even more dramatically awful for us than if we don't destroy the Amazon basin. We'll lose a huge amount of biodiversity. But the easiest way to think about biodiversity is that the other organisms of the planet are the working parts of our life support systems. Without them, we are stone cold dead. And what do those organisms do? They control the pests of our crops. If it weren't for the natural enemies of crop pests, we'd never be able to grow our crops at the level needed. They recycle the nutrients that are absolutely essential for agriculture and for forestry. They can help control the quality of the atmosphere. In other words, when we cut down forests, we're adding CO2 to the atmosphere and changing climate more rapidly. They generate the soils that are absolutely essential to agriculture and to forestry. They pollinate. The pollinators in North America at a lower ground estimate contribute about $16 billion to our agricultural production, and it's a critical, from the point of view of the pleasure of what you eat, it's a super critical part of the services that are supplied to us by nature. They generate the fish in the sea, which we have been wiping out, and also the bushmeat that's used in many areas of the world. So biodiversity is not a luxury; it's an absolute essential. I think one of the things that you sometimes hear, and as a matter of fact, somebody was saying, it was in some newspaper today, that the economic situation is so important that we've got to get rid of, stop worrying about the environment. The human economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of the human environment. If the environment deteriorates, we won't have any economy at all. And the sooner some dumb politicians learn that, the better off we'll be.
But I guess the argument that people are making is that if you just kind of set huge areas off limits, then you are essentially strangling the economy. So, for example, take Anwar, like that, there would be that the oil companies want to go in and just use a small amount of that area, and they claim would be able to get lots and lots of oil out of it.
Well, first of all, you can put aside the issue of whether or not we should put aside huge areas because we haven't. The Anwar is one of the larger ones, but what they've got to learn is you don't want oil companies producing more oil. We can't afford to burn it. We're not running out of fossil fuels. We're running out of environment, and our entire society, global society, will be wrecked by rapid climate change. That's one of the things that's really preposterous about the Iraq War. I mean, to put aside all the political stupidity, all the ignorance that went into it, and so on. It was summarized neatly by one of my colleagues, Gretchen Daly, who said, "Do you really think we're going to be invading Iraq if their major export were broccoli? We don't want that oil. We shouldn't be planning to burn it. We should be moving away from burning coal and oil as fast as we possibly can." So to wreck one of the relatively few still pristine areas on the planet in an attempt to get more oil is absolutely insane. And it isn't. The biodiversity needs to be preserved all over the planet, not just in reserves like Anwar. One of Daly's big projects, the Natural Capital Project, is trying to find ways to keep biodiversity going in the majority of the planet where human beings have already dramatically altered the system. You got to have biodiversity everywhere, and not just in reserves. So, again, it's a complicated issue, but the idea that you would destroy any biodiversity to try and get more oil, something that's basically killing us, is just dumb. I know, not the standard view.
Well, we've been talking for just about an hour now. Before we wrap it up, I wanted to ask you a slightly different question, and I'm asking it sort of out of personal interest. Sometimes, because I write a lot about evolution, I find that people invariably ask me, "Well, what's the future? How are we going to evolve in the future? What are humans going to be like in a million years? Or are we going to be around at all? Are we going to become extinct?" And I always am in awe and point out that I am not, in fact, a scientist, which is sort of a cop-out in that case. But I want to ask you, do you ever get that question, particularly in the context of all the things we've been talking about how humans evolve, about how that evolution has gotten us into this fix we're in, and what we need to do in the future? Do you ever kind of think about the much longer future?
Yeah, well, I and other scientists do. I think the most, in a sense, cheering thing to say about that is that you and I are alive at a time when a large part of that choice is going to be made. In other words, I don't picture human beings, if we manage to avoid blowing up the planet, wrecking the environment, actually transition back to, say, a sustainable society of, say, about 2 billion people, which is probably possible with lots of options for everybody, maybe 1.5 billion, but somewhere around the number when I was born and when we already had huge cities but still wilderness left, so there were lots of different options, then I can imagine us having a million years of intellectual growth, maybe even exploration of a chunk of the universe. It's very hard to predict where technology will take us, but I don't think we're going to evolve huge, bigger heads or something like that, because I think our technologies for dealing with things like human development, whether we like it or not, are going to get better and better and better, and we'll be facing, people will be facing in the future weirder choices. I mean, you can see right now the kinds of choices that are going to get even worse. For instance, medical science is getting better and better at preserving premature babies at earlier and earlier stages. Mm-hmm. But the other side of the coin is the earlier you preserve them, the worse their chances are of having a decent life. And certainly it's going to be technically possible one of these days to get back and just take a zygote, a fertilized egg, or maybe even just an egg or a sperm, and create a human being out of it. And that's going to present huge ethical dilemmas. So I see most of our evolution in the future being cultural evolution, and because we're going to be able to control a lot of the biological evolution if we manage to save our environment and not blow each other up. And I will find that I think it'll be very interesting. I don't envision human beings ever living in just a non-problematic state, because our culture is so great and our abilities are so great that we're going to create dilemmas continuously for ourselves as we try and make our lives better. And I think with luck we'll do very well at making our lives better, but they're never going to be, as far as I can see, free of problem. How's that for dodging the question?
It's a very thought-provoking dodge, I have to say. No, I think that's a good note to end on.
Okay, well, it's been a pleasure talking to you. And if you need to question something or redo something or do it again sometime, I'd be delighted. It's been fun.
Okay, great. All right, well, take care.
Okay, you take care too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.